I woke up one Tuesday morning to find my kitchen sink bone dry, and when I checked the bathroom, not a single drop came from the showerhead either. The first thing that crossed my mind was that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the plumbing in my house. But then, I noticed my neighbor across the street watering his lawn without any issue whatsoever. That was when I knew something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with broken pipes and everything to do with the HOA president, who had been making my life miserable for the past 3 months. My name is Marcus Reid, and I had purchased my home in the Pleasant Valley Estates subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona, about 8 months prior to this water disaster. The house itself was beautiful, a modest 3-bedroom ranch-style property with a decent backyard and a 2-car garage. The neighborhood seemed quiet and friendly when I first moved in, and for the first few months, everything was exactly what I had hoped for when I decided to leave apartment living behind. I worked as a software engineer for a tech company based in Phoenix, which meant I had a comfortable income and could finally afford to own rather than rent. The problem started when I painted my front door a deep navy blue color. I had always loved that shade, and I thought it would add some character to the otherwise beige and white exterior of my home. The HOA covenants that I had signed when purchasing the property did mention exterior modifications, but the language was vague enough that I figured a simple door color change would not cause any issues. I was wrong about that assumption in ways I could not have possibly imagined. 2 days after I finished painting the door, I received a letter in my mailbox from the Pleasant Valley Estates Homeowners Association. The letter was typed on official letterhead with crisp formatting and formal language that made it seem like I had committed some kind of serious offense. It stated that my door color violated the community aesthetic standards, and that I needed to repaint it to an approved color within 14 days or face daily fines of $50. The letter was signed by Patricia Danforth, the HOA president, in blue ink with a flourish that suggested she took great pride in her position. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to discuss the matter in person. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse on a Thursday evening, and about 15 other homeowners were in attendance along with the 5 board members. Patricia sat at the center of the long table at the front of the room, flanked by the vice president and secretary on either side. She was in her late 40s with shoulder-length blonde hair that was styled in a way that probably required significant time and hairspray each morning. She wore a cream-colored blazer over a patterned blouse, and her makeup was applied with precision. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who valued control and presentation above all else. When the open forum portion of the meeting arrived, I raised my hand and was acknowledged by Patricia with a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. I stood up and explained my situation as calmly and reasonably as I could manage. I mentioned that the covenant language about exterior colors was not specific, that navy blue was a tasteful and common door color in many neighborhoods, and that I hoped we could come to some kind of reasonable compromise. I even brought up examples from other upscale neighborhoods in Scottsdale, where colorful doors were not only allowed, but encouraged as a way to add charm and individuality to the community. Patricia listened to my entire explanation without interrupting, her expression remaining neutral throughout. When I finished speaking and sat back down, she cleared her throat and launched into what could only be described as a lecture. She explained in a patronizing tone that the HOA board had carefully cultivated a specific aesthetic for Pleasant Valley Estates over the past 12 years, and that this aesthetic was part of what made the neighborhood desirable and helped maintain property values. She stated that navy blue was too bold and drew unnecessary attention, which went against the harmonious and cohesive look that the community was known for. She concluded by saying that the board's decision was final, and that I needed to comply with the repaint order within the specified time frame. I felt my frustration building, but tried to keep my voice level when I responded. I asked what the approved door colors were, since that information had not been included in the original letter. Patricia pursed her lips slightly before answering that approved colors included white, cream, beige, light gray, and certain shades of brown. Basically, she wanted me to paint my door to match the bland, washed-out palette that made every house on the street look nearly identical. I pointed out that this seemed excessive for something as small as a front door, and that was when her demeanor shifted from merely condescending to openly hostile. She leaned forward slightly in her chair and informed me in a voice that carried throughout the entire room that people who purchased homes in HOA communities agreed to abide by community standards, and if I had wanted complete freedom to do whatever I pleased with my property, I should have purchased a home outside of an HOA. Several other board members nodded in agreement, and I could see a few of the other homeowners in attendance looking uncomfortable with the exchange, but saying nothing. I realized in that moment that arguing further would be pointless, so I simply thanked everyone for their time and left the meeting. The next day, I repainted my front door a boring shade of beige that matched my garage door. It looked completely unremarkable, which I assumed was exactly what Patricia wanted. I took photos of the completed work and emailed them to the HOA email address listed on their website, along with a brief note stating that I had complied with their directive. I thought that would be the end of it, that Patricia would move on to bothering some other homeowner about some other trivial violation. Once again, I was completely wrong. Over the following weeks, I received 3 more violation notices from the HOA. The first claimed that my trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though I had rolled them back to their storage spot beside my garage within an hour of the trash truck coming through. The second notice stated that my lawn had exceeded the maximum allowed grass height of 3 inches, which seemed absurd because I had literally mowed 2 days before receiving the letter. The third notice was perhaps the most ridiculous, claiming that I had parked my car on the street overnight, which was apparently prohibited except for guests. I had parked in the street exactly once when I had some friends over for a barbecue, and I had moved my car into my driveway before 10 o'clock that same evening. Each notice came with the same threat of daily fines if I did not immediately correct the supposed violation. I responded to each one with detailed explanations, and in some cases photographic evidence that I was in compliance with the rules. My emails were either ignored or met with brief replies from Patricia stating that the violations had been documented and that the board stood by its assessments. It became clear that she was targeting me specifically, and I strongly suspected it was because I had dared to question her authority at that board meeting. I started documenting everything obsessively. I took time-stamped photos of my trash cans, my lawn, and where my car was parked each day. I kept copies of every email exchange and every letter I received from the HOA. I even installed a simple security camera above my garage that had a view of my driveway and front yard, just so I would have video evidence if Patricia tried to claim I had violated some other obscure rule. Several of my neighbors noticed my increased vigilance, and a few of them quietly told me that they had also had problems with Patricia in the past. One couple mentioned that she had fined them repeatedly over the placement of decorative planters on their front porch, until they finally just removed the planters entirely. Another neighbor said that Patricia had tried to force him to remove a small fountain from his backyard, because she claimed the sound of running water was disturbing to nearby residents, even though his property backed up to empty desert land with no houses behind it. The pattern that emerged from these conversations was clear. Patricia Danforth was not interested in genuinely maintaining community standards or property values. She was interested in exerting power and control over the people around her, and she used her position as HOA president to do exactly that. The other board members either actively supported her authoritarian approach or were too intimidated to push back against her. It was a toxic situation, but I kept hoping that if I just followed every rule to the letter and documented my compliance, she would eventually lose interest and move on to easier targets. Then came the morning when my water stopped working, and I knew immediately that Patricia had escalated things to a completely different level. I grabbed my phone and called the City of Scottsdale Water Department to find out what was going on. After navigating through the automated phone system and waiting on hold for about 10 minutes, I finally reached a customer service representative named Julie, who seemed genuinely confused when she looked up my account. "Mr. Reid, according to our system, your water service was disconnected yesterday afternoon at the request of your homeowners association," she explained. "It says here that there was an outstanding violation related to unauthorized irrigation usage, and the HOA submitted a formal request for disconnection until the issue was resolved." I felt my blood pressure spike. That is completely false. I do not even have an irrigation system installed. I water my lawn with a regular hose and sprinkler that I move around manually. There is no violation, and there is absolutely no legitimate reason for my water to be shut off. Julie was silent for a moment, presumably reviewing more information on her computer. "I see. Well, the request came through the proper channels with what appeared to be valid authorization, so our field team processed it. However, if you are saying this was done in error or without proper cause, I can escalate this to my supervisor and we can look into getting your service restored as quickly as possible." "Yes, please do that," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking with anger. "I need my water turned back on immediately. This is completely unacceptable." Julie assured me that she would flag my account as a priority, and that someone from the water department would contact me within a few hours. I thanked her and hung up, then immediately started searching through my filing cabinet for all the HOA documentation I had accumulated. I needed to understand exactly what authority, if any, the HOA actually had when it came to utility services. After reading through the covenants and bylaws twice, I could find nothing that gave the HOA the right to request disconnection of utilities for individual homes. There were provisions about shared amenities and common area utilities, but nothing about individual residential services. I decided my next call needed to be to a lawyer. I had a friend from college named David Chen who practiced real estate law in Phoenix, and while HOA disputes were not his primary specialty, I figured he would at least be able to point me in the right direction. I called his office and explained the situation to his receptionist, who told me David was in court that morning but would call me back during his lunch break. True to his word, David called me around noon. "Marcus, this is absolutely not legal," he said after I had walked him through everything that had happened. "An HOA cannot just call a utility company and have someone's water shut off as a punitive measure. That is not how any of this works. Even if you actually had committed some kind of serious violation, which it sounds like you have not, the process for enforcement involves fines, liens, and potentially legal action. Not cutting off your access to essential utilities. So what do? I asked. "The water department said they are looking into it, but I don't know how long that is going to take, and I kind of need running water in my house." David thought for a moment before responding. "Okay, here is what I recommend. First, document everything. Take photos showing that you do not have an irrigation system. Save all your email correspondence with the HOA, and keep a record of every conversation you have with the water department. Second, file a formal complaint against the HOA with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. They oversee HOA regulations in the state, and they take this kind of abuse seriously. Third, consider sending a demand letter to the HOA threatening legal action if they do not immediately rectify the situation. I can draft that for you if you want. Yes, I definitely want that letter, I said. How much is this going to cost me? For a demand letter, I will do it for $200 as a favor since we go back. If this turns into actual litigation, that is a different conversation, but let's hope it doesn't come to that. Give me the rest of the day to put something together, and I will email you a draft by this evening. I thanked David and spent the rest of the afternoon taking the photos he had suggested and organizing all my documentation into a clear timeline. I also filled out the online complaint form on the Arizona Department of Real Estate website, providing as much detail as possible about Patricia's pattern of harassment and the illegal water shutoff. By the time I finished, it was almost 4 o'clock and I still had not heard back from the water department supervisor. I decided to call again, and this time I was connected to a man named Robert Morales, who identified himself as the district operations manager. His tone was significantly more serious than Julie's had been that morning. "Mr. Reid, I have been reviewing your case this afternoon and I have some concerns about how this disconnection was processed," he said. "Our standard procedure when we receive a request from an HOA is to verify that the request relates to common area utilities or shared services. We should never disconnect individual residential service based solely on an HOA request without additional verification. It appears that error was made in your case, and for that I apologize." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I really need to know when my water is going to be turned back on." "I have already dispatched a crew to your location, and they should be arriving within the next hour to restore your service," Robert replied. "Additionally, I am launching an internal review to determine how this request was approved in the first place, and whether the person who submitted it misrepresented the nature of the situation. If we find that false information was provided to our department, there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" I asked. "Well, making a false report to a municipal utility department could result in fines against the HOA and potentially against the individual who made the report. We also would flag that HOA in our system to prevent similar incidents in the future. I cannot give you specific numbers right now because I need to complete the investigation first, but I want you to know that we take this seriously." That was the first piece of genuinely good news I had heard all day. I thanked Robert profusely, and he gave me his direct phone number in case I had any other issues. About 45 minutes later, a City of Scottsdale truck pulled up in front of my house, and 2 workers in bright yellow vests got out. They went straight to the water meter on the side of my property, and within 10 minutes, I heard the beautiful sound of water running through my pipes again. I tested every faucet in the house just to make sure everything was working properly, and the relief I felt was immense. That evening, David emailed me the draft of the demand letter. It was professionally written and extremely direct. It outlined the illegal water shutoff, referenced the relevant Arizona statutes that Patricia had violated, and demanded that the HOA provide written assurance that no further retaliatory actions would be taken against me. It also stated that if the HOA did not respond within 5 business days, I would pursue legal action seeking damages, attorney fees, and injunctive relief. I approved the letter immediately, and David said he would send it via certified mail the next morning, so we would have proof of delivery. I half expected Patricia to show up at my door to confront me, but the next few days passed without any direct contact. However, I did receive the certified mail receipt showing that the demand letter had been delivered to the HOA's registered agent, which according to the official documents was Patricia herself. I figured she was probably consulting with the HOA's lawyer to figure out how to respond, and I was curious to see what excuse she would try to come up with. The response arrived exactly 4 days after the demand letter was delivered. It came in the form of an email from an attorney named Gerald Hoffman, who identified himself as legal counsel for the Pleasant Valley Estates Homeowners Association. The email was condescending in tone and claimed that the HOA had acted within its rights based on reports of excessive water usage in my property. It stated that the HOA had a responsibility to ensure that community resources were not being wasted, and that the temporary disconnection was a reasonable measure to investigate the reported violation. The email concluded by saying that since the water department had found no evidence of excessive usage, the matter was now closed and no further action would be taken. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that what Patricia had done was illegal, and certainly no assurance that it would not happen again. I forwarded the email to David immediately. He called me within 20 minutes, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. "This is complete garbage, Marcus. They are trying to reframe an illegal, retaliatory action as a legitimate investigation. They know they messed up, but they are hoping you will just accept this non-apology and move on." "So what do we do now?" I asked. "Now we file a lawsuit," David said. "We sue Patricia Danforth individually and the HOA as an entity. We go after them for harassment, abuse of authority, and violations of Arizona's HOA statutes. We also loop in the fact that the water department is conducting its own investigation, which will support our case. This is not going to be a quick process, but based on everything you have told me and all the documentation you have provided, I think we have a very strong case." I took a deep breath. I had never sued anyone before, and the thought of getting involved in litigation was daunting. But I also knew that if I did not push back against Patricia's behavior, she would just continue to target me and probably escalate even further. "Okay, let's do it. What do you need from me?" Over the next week, David and I worked together to prepare the lawsuit. He had me write out a detailed chronology of every interaction I had had with Patricia and the HOA, including dates, times, and exact quotes from conversations where possible. We compiled all the violation notices I had received, all the emails I had sent in response, and all the photographic evidence I had gathered. We also included the documentation from the water department showing that my service had been disconnected at the HOA's request, and then restored after the error was discovered. David filed the lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court on a Monday morning, and we had Patricia and the HOA served with the complaint later that same day. I knew that once the lawsuit became public knowledge, things in the neighborhood were probably going to get uncomfortable, but I was past the point of caring about maintaining a polite facade. Patricia had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and I was determined to hold her accountable. The reaction from my neighbors was mixed. A few people approached me privately to express their support and to share their own stories of being harassed by Patricia. One neighbor even offered to provide a written statement for my lawsuit describing how Patricia had targeted her family over a dispute about holiday decorations. However, there were also neighbors who seemed to think I was causing unnecessary drama and that I should have just worked things out privately with the HOA board. One person actually suggested that I was being overly sensitive and that Patricia was just trying to do her job. I found that perspective baffling given everything that had happened, but I also realized that some people were simply conflict-averse and would rather keep their heads down than stand up against unfair treatment. About 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, I received a call from Robert Morales at the water department. He told me that their internal investigation had been completed and that they had determined Patricia Danforth had indeed provided false information when requesting the disconnection of my water service. She had claimed that I had installed an unpermitted irrigation system that was causing water waste, and she had represented herself as acting on behalf of a formal HOA board resolution. Neither of those claims was true, and the water department had documentation proving that she had fabricated the violation. Based on these findings, we are issuing a formal citation and fine against the Pleasant Valley Estates Homeowners Association in the amount of $5,000, Robert explained. This fine is for making a false report to a municipal utility department and for causing the wrongful disconnection of residential water service. We are also flagging your HOA in our system, which means that any future requests for service disconnections will require additional verification and approval from a senior manager before being processed. I was stunned. $5,000 was a significant fine, and the fact that the water department was taking such strong action validated everything I had been saying about Patricia's behavior. What happens if they refuse to pay the fine? I asked. Then we can pursue collection through the courts and potentially place a lien on the HOA's assets, Robert said. But most organizations pay these fines because fighting them is more expensive than just paying up. We will be sending the formal citation via certified mail within the next few days, and they will have 30 days to submit payment. I thanked Robert for his diligence and for taking my complaint seriously. After we hung up, I immediately called David to give him the update. He was thrilled with the news and said that the water department's findings would significantly strengthen our lawsuit. He also suggested that we amend our complaint to include the fact that the city had independently determined Patricia had made false reports, since that would make it much harder for her to claim she had been acting in good faith. The following Monday, I received a notification that the HOA had scheduled an emergency board meeting for that Thursday evening. The meeting agenda listed only one item: discussion of pending legal matters and potential board actions. I knew this meeting had to be about the lawsuit, and probably also about the fine from the water department. I debated whether to attend, since I figured it would be extremely awkward, but ultimately decided that I had every right to be there as a homeowner in the community. The clubhouse was more crowded than I had ever seen it when I arrived Thursday evening. At least 30 homeowners were packed into the room, and the tension was palpable. Patricia sat at her usual spot at the center of the board table, and she looked noticeably less composed than usual. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than her typical styled look, and she wore minimal makeup. The other 4 board members looked equally uncomfortable, whispering among themselves as people continued to file into the room. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock and launched into a prepared statement. She claimed that the HOA was facing baseless legal attacks from a disgruntled homeowner who refused to follow community rules. She characterized me as someone who wanted special treatment and who was willing to waste everyone's time and money to get his way. She made no mention of the water shutoff or the fine from the water department, and she certainly did not acknowledge any wrongdoing on her part. Before she could continue, a man I recognized as living 3 houses down from me stood up and interrupted her. His name was Tom Patterson, and I had spoken with him briefly a few times at neighborhood gatherings. "Patricia, with all due respect, I think you need to tell everyone here what actually happened," Tom said firmly. "You cannot just gloss over the fact that the city fined the HOA $5,000 because you lied to the water department about Marcus Reid having violations. I have seen the documentation. We all know what you did." The room erupted in murmured conversations, Patricia's face flushed red and she stammered for a moment before trying to regain control. That fine is based on a misunderstanding of the situation, and we are exploring our options for appealing it. The board acted in what we believe to be the best interests of the community. The board did not act. A woman named Susan Martinez called out from the back of the room. You acted, Patricia. You have been harassing Marcus for months over petty nonsense, and now your vendetta has cost this HOA thousands of dollars. Not to mention the liability we are facing from the lawsuit. I think it is time for you to resign. A chorus of agreement rippled through the room. Patricia looked genuinely shocked that people were turning against her. She tried to argue that she had always put the community first and that her dedication to maintaining standards was being unfairly criticized. But the more she talked, the more people pushed back. Multiple homeowners stood up to share their own experiences of being targeted by Patricia over minor or imaginary violations. The picture that emerged was of an HOA president who had systematically abused her authority for years, and people were finally fed up. The vice president, a man named Richard Kelly who had always seemed to defer to Patricia, cleared his throat and spoke up. Patricia, I think you need to seriously consider stepping down. This situation has gotten out of hand, and I do not believe the board can effectively function with you as president given everything that has happened. Patricia stared at him with a look of utter betrayal. You are all turning on me, after everything I have done for this community. I have spent countless hours dealing with violations, organizing events, managing the budget, and this is the thanks I get. You shut off a man's water because he painted his door a color you did not like, Tom said bluntly. That is not dedication, Patricia. That is abuse of power. And if you do not resign voluntarily, I am going to make a formal motion to have you removed from the board. Patricia sat in silence for a long moment, her jaw clenched tightly. Finally, she gathered her papers into her bag and stood up. Fine, you want me gone, you have it. I resign, effective immediately. Good luck managing this community without me. You are all going to realize how much work I actually did around here. She walked out of the clubhouse without another word, leaving the remaining 4 board members staring at each other in apparent disbelief. The room was silent for a few seconds before Richard addressed the crowd. All right, well, that just happened, he said with a nervous laugh. I guess we need to figure out next steps here. First and foremost, I want to apologize to Marcus Reid on behalf of the board. What happened to you was completely unacceptable, and we should have intervened much sooner. If you are willing to discuss a settlement of your lawsuit, I think we would all be open to that conversation. I stood up so everyone could see me. I appreciate the apology, Richard. I do not have any ill will toward the rest of the board or toward this community in general. My issue has always been specifically with Patricia and her behavior. I am willing to discuss settlement terms with my attorney, but I want to make sure that there are protections put in place so nothing like this can happen to anyone else in the future. Richard nodded vigorously. Absolutely. That is more than fair. We will have our attorney reach out to your attorney and hopefully we can resolve this quickly and move forward. The meeting adjourned shortly after that, and several neighbors came up to me to express their support and apologize for not speaking up sooner. Tom Patterson shook my hand and told me he respected the fact that I had stood my ground against Patricia's bullying. Susan Martinez gave me her phone number and said that she wanted to work with me and others to draft new HOA guidelines that would prevent future board members from abusing their authority. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like maybe things were actually going to get better. Over the next few weeks, my attorney David and the HOA's attorney worked out the terms of a settlement agreement. The HOA agreed to pay me $15,000 to cover my legal fees, damages for the water shutoff, and compensation for the harassment I had endured. They also agreed to a formal written apology that would be included in the next HOA newsletter, and they committed to revising the HOA bylaws to include stronger checks and balances on board authority. Specifically, the new bylaws would require board approval by at least 3 members before any enforcement actions could be taken against a homeowner, which would prevent a single person from targeting residents the way Patricia had done to me. The HOA also paid the $5,000 fine to the water department, though they did so only after their attorney confirmed that appealing the fine would be both expensive and futile given the evidence against Patricia. I later learned through neighborhood gossip that Patricia had tried to convince the board to fight the fine and to countersue me for defamation, but the other board members had refused. Apparently, she had sent several angry emails to board members after resigning, blaming them for not supporting her, and claiming that she had been scapegoated for problems that everyone on the board had contributed to. None of the board members responded to her emails, and from what I could tell, she had effectively been ostracized from the community. Meanwhile, Richard Kelly stepped into the role of interim HOA president, and the board scheduled a special election to fill Patricia's vacant seat. I seriously considered running for the board myself, but ultimately decided that I did not want to take on that level of responsibility given how demanding my day job was. Instead, I supported Tom Patterson's candidacy, and he ended up winning the seat by a comfortable margin. One of his first acts as a board member was to propose eliminating the approved color list for front doors, arguing that homeowners should have reasonable freedom to personalize their properties as long as they maintained them in good condition. The motion passed unanimously, and I took great satisfaction in repainting my door the original navy blue that had started this entire mess. The water department's actions ended up having ripple effects beyond just my case. Robert Morales told me in a follow-up conversation that they had reviewed their procedures for processing HOA requests and had implemented new safeguards to prevent similar incidents. They now required HOAs to provide detailed documentation and photographic evidence before any individual residential service could be disconnected, and they flagged all such requests for senior management review. Robert also mentioned that they had identified 2 other cases in the past year where HOAs had requested disconnections under questionable circumstances, and they were reaching out to those homeowners to investigate whether similar abuses had occurred. As for Patricia herself, I did not see or hear from her directly for several months after her resignation. However, I did eventually learn through the neighborhood grapevine that she had put her house on the market and was planning to move to a different part of Scottsdale. One neighbor who had been friendly with Patricia before everything went down told me that Patricia felt humiliated by how everything had unfolded and believed that she could not stay in a community where everyone knew about her downfall. I felt a small twinge of sympathy when I heard that, but it was overshadowed by my relief that she would no longer be in a position to harass me or anyone else in Pleasant Valley Estates. The new HOA board, under Richard's leadership with Tom as an active member, turned out to be significantly more reasonable and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. They organized neighborhood events that people actually wanted to attend, like food truck nights and outdoor movie screenings in the common area. They also established a formal appeals process for homeowners who received violation notices, which included an opportunity to present evidence and have an independent third-party review the case before any fines were assessed. It was everything an HOA should have been from the beginning, and the difference in community morale was noticeable. About 6 months after the settlement was finalized, I was working in my garage on a Saturday afternoon when a car I did not recognize pulled into my driveway. A woman in her 30s got out and approached me with a somewhat nervous smile. She introduced herself as Jennifer Morrison and explained that she was considering purchasing Patricia's old house, which was still on the market. She said the listing agent had mentioned there had been some HOA drama involving the previous president, and she wanted to get a current homeowner's perspective on what the community was actually like. I invited Jennifer to sit on my front porch and gave her an honest rundown of everything that had happened. I explained Patricia's harassment, the illegal water shutoff, the lawsuit, and the subsequent changes that the HOA had implemented. I made sure to emphasize that the problems had been specific to Patricia as an individual, and that the current board was genuinely trying to create a positive community environment. I also told her that if she did decide to buy in Pleasant Valley Estates, she should feel comfortable reaching out to me or any of the other neighbors if she ever had concerns or questions. Jennifer seemed reassured by our conversation and thanked me for being so candid. A few weeks later, I saw a sold sign go up in front of Patricia's former house, and I assumed Jennifer had decided to move forward with the purchase. I made a mental note to welcome her properly once she moved in, maybe with some baked goods or an offer to help with anything she needed. It felt like the neighborhood was finally turning a page and becoming the kind of place I had hoped for when I first bought my house. One evening in late autumn, I was sitting on my back patio enjoying the cooler weather when my phone rang. I did not recognize the number but answered anyway, and I was surprised to hear Patricia's voice on the other end of the line. She sounded subdued, lacking the sharp edge that had characterized every previous interaction we had had. "Marcus, this is Patricia Danforth," she said. "I know you probably do not want to hear from me, but I wanted to call and apologize for everything that happened. I have spent a lot of time reflecting on my behavior over the past year, and I realized that I was completely out of line with how I treated you and several other homeowners. I was genuinely taken aback. An apology was the last thing I had expected from her. I appreciate you saying that, Patricia. That means something, even after everything that happened. I let the power of being HOA president go to my head," she continued. "I convinced myself that I was protecting the community and maintaining standards, but really I was just being controlling and petty. The water shutoff was especially inexcusable, and I am honestly ashamed that I thought that was an appropriate way to handle a disagreement. I am glad the water department and the court system held me accountable, because I clearly was not going to hold myself accountable on my own." We talked for about 15 minutes, and Patricia opened up about some personal struggles she had been dealing with that had contributed to her need to control her environment. She acknowledged that those struggles did not excuse her behavior, but they had given her context for understanding why she had acted the way she did. She told me she was in therapy now, and was working on being less rigid and more empathetic in her interactions with people. She also mentioned that she had moved to a house that was not part of any HOA, which she said was probably for the best given her track record. I told Patricia that I appreciated her apology and her willingness to take responsibility for what had happened. I also said that I hoped she found peace and was able to move forward in a healthier way. When we hung up, I felt a sense of closure that I had not realized I needed. The situation had been resolved legally and financially months ago, but hearing Patricia acknowledge her wrongdoing in her own words completed the emotional resolution of the entire ordeal. Life in Pleasant Valley Estates settled into a comfortable routine after that. The HOA continued to function smoothly under its new leadership, and the community genuinely felt like a community rather than a place where everyone was looking over their shoulders waiting to be cited for some minor infraction. I became friendly with several of my neighbors, including Tom Patterson and Susan Martinez, and we would occasionally get together for backyard barbecues or to watch football games on Sunday afternoons. Jennifer Morrison, the woman who had bought Patricia's old house, turned out to be a great neighbor as well. She was a teacher at a local elementary school and often hosted game nights that brought together people from all over the subdivision. The following spring, the HOA held its annual general meeting to elect officers for the coming year. Richard Kelly had done a solid job as president, but announced that he wanted to step down due to work commitments. Tom Patterson was nominated to replace him, and he won the election with strong support from the community. During his acceptance speech, Tom made a point of thanking me for standing up to Patricia's abuses and for helping to catalyze the changes that had made the HOA more accountable and transparent. I felt a bit embarrassed by the public recognition, but I was also proud that something positive had ultimately come from such a difficult experience. One of the interesting developments that came out of the whole situation was that the story started to spread beyond Pleasant Valley Estates. A local news reporter got wind of what had happened and reached out to me for an interview. I was hesitant at first because I did not want to seem like I was gloating or trying to publicly shame Patricia any further. But David encouraged me to do the interview as a way to raise awareness about HOA abuses and the importance of having proper oversight mechanisms. The resulting news segment aired on a Phoenix television station and focused on the broader issue of HOA overreach in Arizona, using my case as a specific example of what can go wrong when board members are not held accountable. The segment generated quite a bit of discussion on social media and local news forums. Some people shared their own horror stories about HOA conflicts, while others defended the concept of HOAs as necessary for maintaining property values and community standards. I tried not to get too caught up in the online debates, but I did appreciate that the story was shining a light on an issue that affected a lot of people. Several Arizona state legislators even picked up on the conversation and began discussing potential reforms to HOA regulations, though I was realistic about how long it would take for any actual legislative changes to happen. As time went on, the water shutoff incident became something of a legendary story in Pleasant Valley Estates. Newer residents who moved into the neighborhood would eventually hear about it and sometimes ask me for the full story. I usually gave them an abbreviated version, emphasizing the lessons learned rather than dwelling on the drama. The most important lesson, in my view, was that homeowners need to stand up for themselves when they are being treated unfairly, even if doing so is uncomfortable or intimidating. Patricia had gotten away with her behavior for years because most people found it easier to just comply with her demands rather than push back. It was only when someone finally said enough and held her accountable that the situation changed. I also learned a lot about the importance of documentation and following proper procedures. If I had not kept meticulous records of every violation notice, every email exchange, and every instance of Patricia's harassment, it would have been much harder to prove my case both in the lawsuit and to the water department. The security camera I had installed turned out to be invaluable as well, because it provided objective evidence that contradicted several of Patricia's claims. I recommended to other homeowners in the community that they consider similar documentation practices, not because they should expect problems, but because it was better to be prepared just in case. The financial settlement I received from the HOA ended up covering all my legal expenses, and then some. I used the extra money to make some improvements to my house, including installing a new air conditioning system and upgrading my backyard landscaping. Every time I looked at those improvements, I was reminded that standing up for myself had been worth it, even though the process had been stressful and time-consuming. I also set aside a portion of the settlement money for a potential future legal defense fund, just in case I ever found myself in a similar situation again, though I hoped that would never be necessary. My relationship with the HOA board evolved into something genuinely positive. Tom Patterson and I became good friends, and he would often ask for my input on proposed policy changes or enforcement decisions. I appreciated being included in those conversations, and I tried to offer balanced perspectives that considered both the need for community standards and the importance of respecting individual homeowner rights. The board also started holding quarterly open forums where any homeowner could voice concerns or suggestions, which created a much more collaborative atmosphere than had existed under Patricia's leadership. One of the policy changes I was most proud to support was a complete overhaul of the violation notice system. Under the new rules, homeowners received an initial courtesy notice for any alleged violation, which gave them the opportunity to correct the issue or provide an explanation without any threat of fines. Only if the issue persisted after the courtesy notice would formal enforcement proceedings begin, and even then, homeowners had the right to request a hearing before a neutral mediator. The new system eliminated the gotcha mentality that Patricia had fostered and replaced it with an approach focused on education and cooperation. The HOA also established a Good Neighbor Fund, which was a small reserve of money that could be used to help homeowners who were facing genuine hardships. For example, if an elderly resident needed help with lawn maintenance due to health issues, the fund could pay for a landscaping service for a few months, rather than fining the homeowner for an overgrown yard. If a family was struggling financially and needed time to make exterior repairs, the fund could provide assistance or at least grant an extension without penalties. These kinds of common-sense accommodations made the community feel more humane and less like a police state. I remained in contact with Robert Morales at the Water Department for several months after my case was resolved. He told me that the policy changes they had implemented were working well and had already prevented at least 3 other questionable disconnection requests from being processed. He also mentioned that the city was considering expanding those safeguards to other utility services, including electricity and natural gas, to ensure that HOAs could not abuse their authority in those areas either. It was gratifying to know that my bad experience had contributed to systemic improvements that would protect other people in the future. About a year after everything was resolved, I received an unexpected piece of mail from Patricia. It was a handwritten note on simple stationery, and the tone was much more personal than our brief phone conversation had been. She wrote about how she had continued therapy and had come to understand that her need to control others had stemmed from deep insecurity and a fear of chaos in her own life. She explained that she had grown up in a home where everything had to be perfect on the surface, even when things were falling apart behind closed doors, and she had unconsciously replicated that dynamic as HOA president. She thanked me again for forcing her to confront her behavior, even though it had been painful at the time, and she said she was working on building healthier relationships and finding fulfillment in ways that did not involve exerting power over others. I wrote back to Patricia, keeping my response brief but warm. I told her that I was glad she was doing better and that I respected her commitment to personal growth. I also said that I hoped she would continue to extend grace to herself as she worked through these issues, because everyone makes mistakes, and what matters most is how we respond when we are confronted with our failings. I did not hear from her again after that, but I hoped that she was finding the peace and balance she seemed to be seeking. The second anniversary of the water shutoff incident came and went without any fanfare, though I did take a moment to reflect on how much had changed in that time. My house was improved, my relationships with my neighbors were strong, and the HOA was functioning in a way that actually added value to the community rather than creating stress and conflict. I had learned important lessons about standing up for myself, about the power of documentation and legal recourse, and about the difference between authority used constructively versus authority abused. I also thought about the broader implications of what had happened. HOA conflicts are incredibly common across the United States, and many of them never get resolved in a satisfactory way because homeowners feel powerless against the collective authority of a board. My case demonstrated that it is possible to fight back successfully when you have evidence on your side and when you are willing to pursue all available remedies, including legal action if necessary. It also showed the importance of having external oversight, whether from government agencies like the Water Department or from courts that can intervene when HOAs overstep their legal boundaries. Looking back, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I had just repainted my door beige the first time and kept my head down after that. Maybe Patricia would have left me alone, or maybe she would have found some other reason to target me. Either way, I was glad I had chosen to stand up for myself rather than simply accepting unfair treatment. The experience had been stressful and expensive, but it had also been empowering. I had proven to myself that I did not have to be a victim of someone else's power trip, and that standing up for principles, sometimes, requires being willing to endure conflict and discomfort in the short term. The HOA board under Tom's leadership continued to thrive. They successfully negotiated better rates for community landscaping services, which allowed them to improve the common areas without raising HOA dues. They also organized a neighborhood watch program that actually brought people together rather than making everyone paranoid, which had been one of Patricia's failed initiatives from years past. The annual HOA meetings became events that people looked forward to rather than dreaded, with social time built in before and after the business portions. I eventually did run for a board position myself, about 3 years after the water shutoff incident. By that point, I felt more settled in the community and more confident that I could contribute meaningfully without it taking over my life. I was elected as the board secretary, which was a relatively low-key role that mainly involved taking meeting minutes and handling correspondence. It gave me a behind-the-scenes view of how the HOA operated, and I was consistently impressed by how thoughtfully Tom and the other board members approached their responsibilities. They genuinely cared about doing right by the homeowners, and about maintaining the positive changes that had been implemented after Patricia's resignation. One of my responsibilities as secretary was maintaining the HOA's official records, including the archive of past meeting minutes and correspondence. I came across some of Patricia's old files during a records organization project, and reading through them gave me additional insight into her mindset during her time as president. She had kept extensive notes on various homeowners, documenting every interaction and every perceived slight with remarkable detail. It was clear that she had viewed her role as fundamentally adversarial, seeing homeowners as problems to be managed rather than as community members to be supported. The contrast with how the current board operated could not have been more stark. The Pleasant Valley Estates community continued to grow and evolve, with new families moving in and older residents occasionally moving out. Each time someone new joined the neighborhood, they became part of a community that had learned important lessons about governance, accountability, and mutual respect. The story of the water shutoff and Patricia's downfall became part of the community's collective memory, serving as a reminder of what can go wrong when power is concentrated and unchecked, but also as a testament to the possibility of positive change. I maintained my security camera and my habit of documenting important interactions, not because I expected another Patricia to come along, but because those practices had become part of my routine. They gave me peace of mind and ensured that I would be prepared if any future conflicts arose, whether related to the HOA or to other aspects of homeownership. Several neighbors had followed my example and installed their own cameras, which had the added benefit of making the neighborhood safer overall. The relationship between the HOA and the City of Scottsdale Water Department remained positive, with both sides appreciating the importance of clear communication and proper procedures. Robert Morales retired from the Water Department a few years after my case was resolved. But before he left, he sent me a note thanking me for bringing the issues with HOA requests to their attention. He said that the policy changes had prevented numerous problems and had improved the department's relationship with homeowners across the city. It was nice to know that my difficult experience had contributed to making things better for others. As I sit here now, several years removed from that Tuesday morning when I discovered my water had been shut off, I can honestly say that I am grateful for how everything turned out. Not grateful for the harassment or the stress, certainly, but grateful for the lessons learned, the friendships formed, and the positive changes that came out of a negative situation. My navy blue front door has held up beautifully and continues to add character to my home. Every time I walk through it, I am reminded that standing up for what is right is worth the effort, even when the path is difficult. The Pleasant Valley Estates HOA continues to function as a model of how these organizations should operate, with transparency, accountability, and genuine concern for homeowner welfare. Tom Patterson serves his third consecutive term as president and shows no signs of slowing down, though he has groomed several other community members to eventually take over leadership roles. The community has won awards from the city for its well-maintained common areas and for its innovative approaches to sustainable landscaping. Most importantly, homeowners actually like living here, which is the ultimate measure of an HOA's success. I have been asked several times over the years whether I regret buying a home in an HOA community, given everything that happened with Patricia. My answer is always no. The problem was never the HOA structure itself. The problem was one person who abused her authority within that structure. Once that person was removed and proper safeguards were put in place, the HOA became what it was always meant to be: a tool for maintaining and improving a shared community. I would not trade my home or my neighbors for anything, and I am proud to have played a role in making Pleasant Valley Estates the welcoming, well-managed community it is today. The water shutoff incident, as terrible as it was at the time, became a catalyst for meaningful change. It exposed dysfunction that had been festering for years and forced everyone in the community to confront uncomfortable truths about how power had been wielded. The resolution of the incident through legal action, municipal intervention, and community organizing demonstrated that there are multiple pathways to justice and reform. No single approach would have been sufficient on its own, but together they created the pressure necessary to force change. I occasionally drive past Patricia's old house, which Jennifer Morrison has maintained beautifully with her own choice of a cheerful red front door. The house looks happy now, if a house can be said to have an emotional quality, and I imagine Patricia would probably be irritated by that red door if she could see it. But that is no longer my concern or anyone else's in this community. We have moved on to building something better, and that is exactly where our focus should be. The story of HOA Karen who got my water shut off as revenge ultimately became a story of accountability, reform, and community resilience. The utility company fined the HOA, restored my water, and implemented systemic changes to prevent future abuses. The legal system provided a path to justice and compensation. The community came together to demand better leadership and better policies. And in the end, everyone except Patricia ended up better off for having gone through the experience. Sometimes conflict is necessary to create the conditions for positive change, and this was definitely one of those times.